All right, so welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we are heading straight into a world of international intrigue, hidden identities, and a little bit of hypocrisy. Maybe you ready to jump in?
Always down for a good mystery.
Perfect. Okay, so today's subject is Vladimir Putin. The ever enigmatic leader of Russia, right? And a Telegraph article came out alleging that he has a daughter living in Paris under a fake name. Now, the real deep dive today is actually going to focus on a Reddit thread that's discussing the article. It gives us a chance to see kind of how the public is reacting to all this news.
Yeah, it's really interesting, how social media can be such a window into public sentiment, especially on things like this, sensitive topics.
Exactly. Okay, so let's just start with the alleged daughter, Luiza Rozova. What can you tell us about her?
Well, so she's supposedly living in Paris under this name, Elizaveta Oligovna Rodnova. At least that's according to this Ukrainian media outlet. And they say they found all this info from leaked airline manifests.
The lead airline manifest. That's pretty resourceful.
Right. It really shows the power of open source intelligence nowadays. They also found her birth date, March 3rd, 2003. And her birth certificate doesn't actually list a father, but they say the Russian naming convention, it kind of points to Putin.
Okay, so we've got a secret identity and maybe a link to the Kremlin. Sounds like a spy novel already. But what kind of life is she? Is she living in Paris? Is she constantly looking over her shoulder?
Actually, not at all. The information out there suggests a pretty privileged life. She DJs, attends fashion shows, the whole Parisian lifestyle. There's a kind of irony to it all when you say.
Definitely. And it's interesting you say that because a bunch of Reddit users were pointing out, the difference between her lifestyle and what most Russians are going through, especially now.
Absolutely. It really hits you when you remember that Luiza herself, she apparently said in a Clubhouse conversation back in 2021 that she lives in a bubble, detached from the news and politics and all that.
Wow. Imagine trying to tune out the whole world when your dad is, one of the most influential figures globally. I wonder if that's a choice, like a way to kind of distance herself from her family.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. But to understand, her possible motivations, we need to look at her mom, Svetlana Krivonogikh.
Right. Okay, let's talk about her. This is where things get really interesting. I mean, her story is straight out of a movie, rags to riches. She goes from being a cleaner to one of the wealthiest women in all of Russia.
It's true. She's reportedly worth a crazy amount, 83 million fours, and she owns multiple homes in Monte Carlo, has a yacht, and she holds big positions in some really important Russian institutions.
Hold on. Multiple homes, a yacht. That doesn't sound like just, a lucky break. Yeah. What kind of positions are we talking about?
Well, so for one, she's on the board of Bank Russia, which is, it's known to be favored by, the Russian elite. And then she's also a director at National Media Group. It's a massive media group. And, well, you guessed it, it's controlled by the Kremlin.
Okay, so significant wealth and deep ties to Russia's power structure, specifically in areas that control money and information, right? And to make things even more complicated, the UK actually sanctioned her last year for actively supporting Russia's actions in Ukraine.
It's definitely a complicated web, that's for sure. And it does make you think, what was her relationship with Putin really like, and how did she get all this wealth and power?
It really does. And this web gets even more tangled when we consider Putin's other family ties,
Right. He has two daughters, Maria and Katerina, from his previous marriage, And then there are all those rumors about the relationship with Alina Kabayeva, the Olympic gymnast.
Yeah, the rumors about Alina Kabayeva and the two sons they supposedly have, those have been going around forever, even though Putin denies it all the time.
Totally. But, it's interesting. Even with all these confirmed and rumored family members, it's the daughter in Paris that's getting the most attention.
Maybe it's because, she's in Paris and her dad's, well, Putin. Or maybe it's all the mystery surrounding her. Whatever it is, it's sparked a lot of reactions in that Reddit thread we talked about.
Oh, for sure. People are sharing all kinds of opinions, from full-on skepticism to, outrage.
Okay, well, let's get into those reactions. What are some of the main things you're seeing?
One thing that pops out is just how many different perspectives there are. You've got people questioning if any of this is even true, and then you've got others focusing on, how hypocritical it all seems.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, it does seem a little ironic, right? Some Russian elites are condemning the West while their kids are, enjoying all the freedoms that those societies offer.
Exactly. And then some are even pointing out how dangerous it could be for Luiza, Like, she could become a target or a pawn in some political game.
That's uh, a pretty scary thought. It
Yeah.
really shows how just being connected to Putin, no matter what you believe, it can have some serious consequences.
Absolutely. And then there are people who are worried for her, Like, they say she should be left alone and that it's not her fault what her dad's doing.
It's that question, right? Like, how much are we responsible for what our family does? It's a tough one
Yeah.
with no easy answers.
Totally. And it's really interesting to see how these individual reactions reflect, like, bigger social and political worries.
Speaking of anxieties and social commentary, you mentioned a Russian joke earlier, something about bombing Voronezh. What was that about?
It's a pretty dark joke, but it kind of says a lot about how Russians feel. It goes like this. These Russian generals are discussing bombing targets, right? And they rule out all the Western cities because, well, their families live there. So the punchline is they should bomb Voronezh, a city in Russia, because there are definitely none of ours there.
Okay, I get the humor, but what does this say about how Russians view their leadership?
Well, the joke shows how cynical a lot of ordinary Russians are. They kind of see their leaders as out of touch and looking out for themselves. And that disconnect between the people in charge and everyone else, it can have some big consequences politically and socially.
That's a really good point. It shows how humor, even dark humor, can be a way to criticize those in power.
Yeah.
But it also makes you think that maybe people are just resigned to this disconnect being the reality.
Exactly. And that feeling of resignation can be just as dangerous as, outright protest. But before we go too deep into the politics of it all, there's something else I wanted to get your thoughts on, something that struck me about this whole story.
Okay, I'm all ears. What is it?
I think the reactions in that Reddit thread really highlight like the human element of this whole, complex geopolitical situation.
That's so true. It's easy to get caught up in like the big picture analysis, but at the end of the day, these are individuals with their own, desires and fears. We're talking about like a young woman figuring out life in the shadow of her father and a mother who's gone through this huge change in status and wealth. These are personal stories that are like totally intertwined with what's happening globally.
And those personal stories, they often get lost, don't they? We focus on the politics and the international stuff, but we forget that these are real people who are being affected.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that even in, global politics, the personal is always political and vice versa. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one more thing I want to touch on. The reactions on Reddit, they really highlight this bigger idea that's, I think, relevant to a lot of what's happening in the world.
I'm listening. What are you thinking about?
This idea of individual accountability versus collective responsibility. On the one hand, some people think Luiza should be held responsible for what her father does, while others say she should be judged on her own actions. It's a debate that goes way beyond just this one case, and it raises some really tough questions.
You're right. It makes you think about where we draw the line between, taking responsibility for yourself and the influence of family or even society. It comes up in so many different contexts, from politics to inherited wealth to systemic issues. And it's just, there are no easy answers.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. It's not just about one, alleged daughter in Paris. It's about these bigger questions of family, power, and how people deal with those forces.
It's about seeing the nuances, the complexities, and the gray areas in stories that seem, straightforward at first.
Perfectly said. And on that note, we're gonna wrap up part one of our deep dive into Luiza Rozova's story.
Looking at all this, it does raise questions about how effective sanctions really are.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, we talked about how the UK sanctions Svetlana Krivonogikh for supporting Russia's actions in Ukraine.
Sure.
But if she's living this like extravagant lifestyle, are those sanctions actually doing anything?
It's a question a lot of people are asking. Some argue that sanctions, they mostly hurt, regular citizens, while the people in power, they just find ways around them.
I can see how that would like make people resentful and disillusioned.
Yeah.
Both in Russia and in other countries.
Exactly. It just feeds into that idea that the elite are disconnected, living by their own rules.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to that Reddit thread, where so many users were comparing Luiza's life in Paris to the realities of most Russians.
Yeah, the contrast is pretty stark. I mean, some are enjoying this like luxurious life, while others are dealing with economic hardship.
Exactly. And that kind of disparity can really contribute to, social unrest and political instability.
One of the comments that really stuck with me from that Reddit thread was uh, someone asking, is this a form of silent protest?
Ah, you mean the speculation about why Louisa chose to live in Paris? Like, is she trying to distance herself from her father's regime?
Exactly. What do you think? Could could being in the West be her way of, like, subtly rejecting her father's ideology?
It's possible. I mean, some people think that choosing to live in a democratic society, especially one that her father, criticizes a lot, could be a way for her to express dissent.
It would definitely send a mixed message, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Especially now with, everything going on.
It would. And it could even be seen as a security risk by the Kremlin. Imagine the propaganda they could make if something happened to her while she's in Paris.
That's,
Yeah.
that's not a nice thought. It really shows how precarious her situation is, caught between these two worlds, these two ideologies.
And it makes you wonder, is she aware of all this? Is she making a statement, or is she just, living her life without thinking about the politics?
I guess we can only guess. But it does remind you that even, like, personal choices can get caught up in these big political narratives.
For sure. And that entanglement is what makes this whole story so fascinating. It's like a microcosm of that tension between Russia and the West playing out in, one person's life.
It also makes you think about the power of individual actions. Even if she's not trying to make a political statement, just her being in Paris, it challenges, the narrative that Putin's trying to put out there.
It does. It creates this dissonance, right? Here's this leader who's, constantly criticizing the West, but his own daughter chooses to live there. It makes him seem, well, less credible, at least to some people.
And that could have, like, a ripple effect, right? It could embolden people in Russia who are critical of the regime, or even inspire others to question the official story.
You're getting it. Small actions can have these unintended consequences, especially in a world that's so, connected.
And speaking of unintended consequences, let's go back to the sanctions for a second. Some experts think that putting sanctions on people like Svetlana Krivonogikh can actually have the opposite effect.
Right. Some people think that this kind of sanction can actually make people rally around the regime they're supposed to weaken.
So instead of isolating the people in power, it could actually push them closer to the regime and make their position stronger.
Exactly. And that's why this whole story is so nuanced. It's not just good versus evil. It's this complicated mix of competing interests and motivations and perceptions.
It reminds us that there are always multiple sides to every story, and that the world doesn't always fit into our neat little boxes.
Well said. And that's what makes these deep dives so valuable. They challenge us to think critically, to question what we think we know, and to really embrace how complicated the world is.
I totally agree. And this deep dive in particular has me thinking about this idea of liminality, which I find really interesting.
Oh, I like where you're going with this. Tell me more.
Well, liminality is about being in between, like on the threshold between two different worlds or identities. And I can't help but see Luiza as this liminal figure in this whole story.
It's a perfect analogy. She's caught between Russia and the West, between her father's legacy and her own aspirations. She's in this uncertain space where the old rules don't really apply.
And that liminal space, it can be so powerful for both personal growth and societal change. It's where new ideas come from, where boundaries are blurred, where the status quo is challenged.
That's a great way to put it. It really makes you wonder, what role could people like Luiza play in shaping the future, both in Russia and globally?
I think that's a question we'll be thinking about for years to come. But it's a question worth asking, and it's a question that wouldn't even be on our radar if it weren't for this whole deep dive into the story of Putin's daughter in Paris.
Exactly. It shows you the power of curiosity and being open-minded. Sometimes the most unexpected stories can lead to the most profound insights.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive. Thinking about all this, it makes you wonder, like, what happens next?
Yeah. How does this story play out? It's tough to say, for sure.
Exactly. But we can speculate, right? Do you think Luiza being in Paris, could that become like a bargaining chip in some future negotiation between Russia and the West?
I mean, it's not impossible. We've seen similar things happen before, where family members get used as leverage in these international disputes.
That's a scary thought, isn't it? Like a young woman becoming, caught in the middle of of these geopolitical games.
It is, and it really shows you the human cost of all these conflicts, how they affect people way beyond, battlefields and political meetings.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that there are real people with real lives, caught up in all these power struggles.
Yeah.
And their stories, they matter.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of stories, this one has certainly gotten, a lot of attention online.
Oh, yeah, for sure. People are just drawn to the mystery, the intrigue, the fact that, her life is so different from what her father's saying.
It's a story that really seems to capture something about this moment in time, you know? It taps into those anxieties people have about wealth, about hypocrisy in politics, about the future in general.
It's like a real-life soap opera, but with global consequences.
Yeah, there's definitely a dramatic element to it. And that keeps people engaged, keeps them talking, keeps them thinking.
Which is a good thing, right? I mean, it starts conversations, makes people question things, and forces us to look at some uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. And who knows? Maybe all this attention could actually lead to, some positive change.
Now you're making me optimistic. Maybe this story could be like a catalyst for more transparency, more accountability, a better understanding of, how complicated the world really is.
I like how you're thinking. It's important to have hope, even when things seem, really tough.
Well said. And on that note of cautious optimism, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the story of Luiza Rozova.
It's been a fascinating journey. We've talked about so much, from secret identities and leaked documents to sanctions and what people are saying online.
We've gone from the personal to the political to even a philosophical, and we've probably raised more questions than answers, which is often the sign of a really thought-provoking conversation.
It is, and as you keep thinking about this story, I encourage you to hold on to those questions.
Yeah.
What makes people make the choices they do? How do our own actions connect to what's happening in the world? What does it mean to have power and influence, and what are the ethics of that?
These are questions worth wrestling with, even if the answers aren't clear. Absolutely,
Yeah.
because in the end, it's those questions that keep us engaged, keep us learning, keep us trying to understand ourselves and the world better.
Well said. And that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. They're like a journey of discovery, a chance to explore the unknown and come away with new insights and perspectives.
And with that, we'll bring this deep dive to a close. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep your minds open to new possibilities.
And that's a wrap on another deep dive, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this exploration of, international intrigue, political power, and those big questions about personal choices and responsibility. Until next time, stay curious and stay tuned for more deep dives into the fascinating world around us.